So you saw the audience seem to be receptive, maybe even charmed by some of what he said, but widely here in the United States, he's considered a bully. So what did you think of his remarks?
Well, you have to remember, most of the people in the audience were Russians, so you wouldn't lose points for laughing happily at Putin's jokes. No, the Putin I saw there was the same Putin you can meet. He is very aggressive. He has got charm, he's got flair, but he takes no time at all to make the points he needs to do. And from his perspective, you have to remember, inside Russia, what people have been shown continually is appalling pictures of atrocities against Russian-speaking Ukrainians. And the way in which he's depicted himself to the Russian people is as someone who is defending good standards, morality, all those things. So being accused of being aggressive is the last thing he wants, even if that is totally true.
I noticed in the audience also was Gerhard Schröder, former Chancellor of Germany. If you're Angela Merkel and you're listening to this panel discussion, what do you take away?
I think, well, you're possibly slightly embarrassed by Gerhard Schröder being there, but that's not surprising given his business interests. I think your main thing, actually, is I think Angela Merkel, her patience with Putin began to run out. They had an initial bond because she could speak Russian. They used to talk a lot, and that was an original start. But sometime around the shooting of the airliner, after that, she began to get more and more angry. And Merkel's one of those people you talk to, and she's very, very straight. And Putin, I think, does lie to her several times too many.
You know, we've often cited this, John, which is that the opinion polls, whether you believe them or not, still show that Putin is well supported by a majority of the people in his country, right? Something like 60–70% of them. So clearly, sanctions so far, which have crippled the country, have not worked yet. So what is it that is going to make him pay attention?
I think the argument about sanctions, you're absolutely right, Betty. They do not work from the point of view of immediately persuading the Russian people that Putin is to blame for this. You're beginning to hear slight mumblings from the oligarchs, although there was reputedly a meeting early on where one of the oligarchs complained to Putin about the fact that he was losing roughly $1 billion because of the sanctions. And Putin immediately said, well, I made you 20. It's not something which he thinks the business community can't take. But for the Russian people as a whole, I think there is a very strong sense that they think that their way of life is under threat. They also see Putin as a strong man. But that is a very, very fickle thing to change. You can be a strong man who is delivering results, who is seeming to make the economy work. Right. But if it just flicks and it doesn't work, then you become another bully.
He's clearly stoking the nationalist pride, right? I mean, I understand there's a Patriot Park now.
Yes.
That's open because, you know, he'd rather talk ideology than get to the nuts and bolts of what's going on in the country.
Because the nuts and bolts aren't very good.
No.
That's the honest truth, is too many Russians die too young. The prosperity of Russia is anchored around very few areas. And it's a very, very tough country for most people to grow up in. The one thing that Putin did do when he first came in is he did two things, I think. He did right the economy, helped by oil prices. And he also had that sense of self-respect. I mean, Russia had been humiliated in some ways, and he tapped into those two things. But more recently, the oil price has had its difficulties. And with Ukraine, there's a sense that he may have reached too far. You can see quite some evidence. I agree, most of the evidence is that the Russian people as a whole are still wound up by all this propaganda, and it is propaganda, very clearly propaganda, about what the Ukrainians have done. But there is some evidence on the outskirts. You know, people's sons have died in Ukraine, and that is filtering back.
You mentioned energy, and I want to get your thoughts on energy and commodities, Russia and China, because sitting to Vladimir Putin's left was Ronnie Chang, who in the past has at least been an advisor to the Chinese government about business affairs.
That was one of the most interesting bits of it, is Ronnie Chang basically said, look, here you are. Here's Russia and China. We should be great allies. We should be fantastic partners in this. But actually, look at it. There are very few Chinese people in the audience. He pointed out that he was virtually alone. And he said there are very few Russians in China. And that is true. You go to Beijing, you don't meet a lot of Russians. You meet Russians in nightclubs in London, and you meet them owning football clubs. But you don't meet them in places like Beijing. And there is also, it's a difficult relationship, because the Russians are terrified by that border between them and China. On one side, there is millions of Chinese people. On the other side, there's very sparsely populated Russian territory.
Yeah.
And the Russians remain deeply, deeply suspicious about that far eastern border of theirs.
Putin at that conference raised the prospect of aiding Greece. What do you make of that?
I think that it would be a far-fetched and rather kind of gambling move. So in other words, it's exactly the sort of thing that Putin might do. It's
exactly.
not. The answer is he doesn't have enough money to do it in any kind of substantial way. But in terms of making an offer that somehow gives Greece another couple of months and interposes himself in the West. I mean, a lot of what Putin does is about self-respect. It's about making Russia seem as if it's part of it. He leapt on the instance in Syria when Obama failed to punish Assad for using chemical weapons. It was Putin who came in and tidied that up in the Russian rhetoric. And you could imagine the Greek thing. You could imagine him saying, well, look, this is what happened. Greece has got into trouble. We came to the defense of our Orthodox cousins, which is also an important part of the Putin narrative. And that could be something that actually also made a difference. So the answer is I think he probably won't. But it's a sort of gamble that somebody in his position
that sounds just
might
like
try.
him. Yeah.
Yes.